The wind was a blade against the granite shoulders of the mountains, its edge honed on ice and distance. It scoured the high plains, stripping the color from the sky and leaving a wash of bruised gray. From her small cabin, tucked into a fold of the land like a secret, Alara watched the rider. He was a dark stitch against the pale fabric of the landscape, moving with a pained, unnatural slowness. She knew the man, though not his heart. Silas Kane, a man who had buried a wife, and then, too quickly in the town's estimation, taken another. A man with a house full of sons whose laughter she sometimes heard carried on a kinder wind. Today, there was no kindness in the wind, and no strength in the rider. He was hurt. She could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the way his body listed in the saddle, a failing bastion against the gale. His horse, head low, simply endured, plodding toward the silent homestead that seemed to shrink under the vast, oppressive sky. Alara's own life was a study in silence. A widow for 2 years, she had learned the rhythms of solitude, the heft of loneliness. The town's pity had long since curdled into a kind of benign neglect, for which she was grateful. She lived on the fringe, a ghost in her own life, observing more than she participated. She watched now as Silas reached his home. He did not dismount with the weary grace of a man at his journey's end. He slumped, nearly falling, catching himself on the porch rail. He stood there for a long moment, a statue of exhaustion, his head raised as if listening. Alara, even from her window across the barren expanse, could feel the wrongness of it. A house with 6 boys should not be so still, should not be so quiet. The smoke from its chimney was a thin, anemic wisp, quickly torn apart by the wind. It was a house holding its breath. A knot of cold dread, separate from the chill of the afternoon, tightened in Alara's stomach. She knew the new wife, Adeline, only by sight. A woman with a restless energy and eyes that seemed to look past everyone and everything, searching for a more appealing horizon. She had heard the whispers in town, the cruel jests about Silas's haste, about Adeline's flinty ambition. Now, watching him push against his own front door, finding it barred from the inside, that dread became a sharp, insistent thing. He paused, then threw his wounded body against the wood. Once, twice. On the third impact, the frame splintered with a crack that the wind could not swallow. He disappeared inside. The silence that followed was worse than the violence of his entry. It was a dead, hollow void. Alara pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the dark maw of the open door. The world had shrunk to that small, dark rectangle and the terrible possibilities it contained. She knew, with a certainty that propelled her from her chair, that she could not remain a ghost any longer. She had to go. The wind tore at her skirts as she crossed the frozen ground, each step an unwilling pilgrimage toward another's tragedy. The cold inside the Kane cabin was a physical blow, a dead, stagnant cold that was somehow worse than the clean, sharp chill outside. It smelled of stale air and something else, something acrid and fearful. Silas stood in the middle of the main room, his back to her, his broad shoulders trembling. His gaze was fixed on a door at the far end of the room, a heavy plank door to the winter pantry, now scarred by a heavy iron bar that had been wedged beneath its handle. The bar lay on the floorboards beside a splintered frame. From within the shadowed opening came a sound, a thin, wretched whimpering that was barely human. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Silas didn't seem to notice her arrival. He was a man turned to stone by a sight she could not yet see. She moved past him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and peered into the darkness of the pantry. The sight that met her eyes would be etched into her memory forever. 6 small bodies, tangled together on the dirt floor for warmth, like a litter of abandoned pups. They were pale, their lips tinged with a terrifying blue, their eyes glassy and unfocused. The air was thick with the stench of sickness and neglect. They were wrapped in thin, threadbare blankets, their small chests rising and falling in shallow, shuddering breaths. The silence she had sensed from her window was the silence of lives fading, of hope being extinguished in a cold, dark room. The whimpering came from the smallest of them, a boy no older than 3, his tiny face streaked with frozen tears. For a moment, the world tilted, and Alara felt the familiar urge to retreat, to flee back to the safety of her own quiet sorrow. But the sight of Silas, his own face a mask of shattered disbelief and raw, volcanic fury, held her fast. He knelt, his movements stiff from his wound, and reached a trembling hand toward the oldest boy, who flinched away with a choked gasp. The rejection struck Silas like a physical blow. He recoiled, his hand falling to his side, his expression crumbling into pure anguish. In that moment, he was not a stoic rancher. He was a father staring into the abyss of his own failure. A folded piece of paper lay on a nearby crate, stark and white against the grime. Silas hadn't even looked at it. His world had ended at the threshold of that pantry. Alara's paralysis broke. The overwhelming horror receded, replaced by a fierce, cold clarity. Pity was a luxury. Action was a necessity. "The fire," she said, her voice raspy but firm. It was the first word spoken in the house, and it seemed to shatter the spell of shock. Silas looked at her then, his eyes vacant, seeing her for the first time. He didn't respond. He simply stared, lost. "Silas," she repeated, her tone sharper. "The fire. We need blankets. Water on to heat." Now her command cut through his fog. He blinked, and a flicker of awareness returned to his eyes. He nodded slowly, then pushed himself to his feet with a grunt of pain, his body moving with the jerky motions of an automaton. While he clumsily revived the embers in the main hearth, Alara turned back to the children. She entered the cramped, cold space, her own warmth feeling like a blasphemy. She knelt, her hands hesitating for only a second before she began to untangle the small, cold limbs. "It's all right," she whispered, the words feeling thin and inadequate. "I'm here. It's all right now." She gathered the smallest boy, Daniel, into her arms. He was terrifyingly light, his skin like ice. His whimpering subsided into a faint, rattling breath against her neck. She carried him out into the main room, toward the nascent warmth of the growing fire, her mind a blank slate wiped clean of everything but the singular, desperate task of coaxing life back into these small, frozen bodies. The note remained on the crate, an unread testament to the cruelty that had transpired. Adeline was gone. Her absence was as profound and chilling as the cold she had left behind. Silas, moving with a grim, newfound purpose, tore blankets from the beds, his movements violent, ripped by a rage that had no other outlet. He avoided looking at the children, his focus entirely on the tasks Alara assigned him. He was a tool of her will, his own mind too fractured to direct his actions. She worked with a methodical intensity that surprised her. All the quiet, lonely years had not, it seemed, erased an innate knowledge of care. She stripped the boys of their soiled, damp clothes, her hands gentle but efficient, and wrapped them in the heavy wool blankets Silas provided. She laid them in a row before the hearth, a small, fragile bulwark against the death that had so recently lapped at their feet. The house slowly filled with the smell of wood smoke and heating water, a scent of life pushing back against the odor of decay. There was no conversation. Words were an extravagance they could not afford. Their communication was a series of gestures, of shared glances, of needs anticipated and met without a sound. He brought the kettle and she spooned broth from a jar, likely the last of what the boy's own mother had put up, into a pot. He held the pot steady over the flames while she tended to the children, chafing their hands and feet, her touch firm and constant, willing her own warmth into their icy limbs. The oldest boy, Jacob, perhaps 10 years old, watched her with wide, haunted eyes. He did not speak, but his gaze followed her every move, a silent, terrified query. She met his eyes and offered a small, sad smile, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. When the broth was warm, the true test began. She lifted the head of the boy next to Daniel, his face pale and still. She dipped a spoon into the thin liquid and touched it to his lips. He did not respond. Gently, She pried his mouth open and let a few drops trickle in. A faint, reflexive swallow. It was a victory so small it was almost imperceptible, yet it felt monumental. One by one, she moved down the line, Silas holding the pot, his large, calloused hands steady, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He was present in the work, but his spirit was somewhere else, trapped in the cold, dark pantry with his guilt. The long night descended, pressing against the windows of the small cabin, a vast and indifferent darkness. Inside, the world had shrunk to the circle of firelight and the 6 small forms breathing shallowly before it. The vigil was a silent one, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, and the faint, rattling breaths of the children. Alara moved between them, a tireless sentinel. She bathed their faces with warm water, forced more broth between their lips, and adjusted their blankets. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself perform these tasks. The lonely woman from the cabin across the way had vanished, replaced by this fiercely focused caregiver. She was not acting on emotion, but on a primal, deep-seated instinct to protect, to nurture, to fight back the encroaching dark. It was a purpose that filled the hollow spaces within her, a feeling so potent it was almost painful. Silas finally tended to himself. He sat heavily in a chair just outside the main circle of light, pulling his torn shirt away from a dark, ugly wound high on his shoulder. It was clotted with blood and grime. He cleaned it with whiskey and a rag, his face impassive, though Alara saw the tremor in his hands, the sharp intake of breath he could not quite suppress. He worked with a grim competence, his focus absolute, as if the physical pain were a welcome distraction from the agony in his soul. He had still not spoken a full sentence to her. He had not looked at the note. He had not acknowledged the architect of this horror. His entire being was centered on the immediate physical reality of survival, his own and that of his sons. Alara watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw the lines of exhaustion carved around his mouth, the profound grief that shadowed his eyes even in the firelight. He was a man broken, holding the pieces of himself together with sheer, stubborn will. Hours bled into one another. Alara felt a weariness sink into her bones, but she refused to yield to it. Her attention was fixed on Daniel, the youngest. His breathing was the most shallow, his small body periodically shaken by violent tremors. He was the fulcrum upon which all their efforts balanced. If he survived, they all might. She held his small, cold hand in hers, her thumb stroking the back of it, a continuous, rhythmic motion. In the quiet desperation of the night, her own past rose unbidden. She remembered her husband, his life fading in a room that had smelled of sickness and herbs. She had been helpless then, a passive witness to fate. She would not be helpless now. She poured all of her focus, all of her will, into that small hand, as if she could anchor his fleeting spirit to the world through her touch alone. Sometime before dawn, Silas rose and placed another log on the fire. He looked at her, his eyes raw in the flickering light. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of shared exhaustion, of acknowledgement. It was enough. In the crucible of that long, terrible night, a fragile, unspoken alliance had been forged. The first sign of victory was subtle, a dampness on Daniel's brow. Alara touched his forehead, her fingers trembling slightly. It was no longer cold as stone, but warm. Too warm, but it was the heat of a body fighting, not failing. The fever had arrived, a desperate battle waged within his small frame. Throughout the morning, she and Silas worked in tandem to manage it, bathing him with cool cloths, murmuring reassurances he could not hear. The other boys were stirring, their breathing deeper, their color slowly returning from blue-white to a pale, fragile pink. Jacob, the eldest, sat up, his blanket pooled around his waist. He didn't speak, but his eyes, less haunted now, followed his father. He watched as Silas, his own face gray with fatigue, checked the dressing on his shoulder before moving to the stove to brew coffee. The familiar, domestic sent a fragile assertion of normalcy in the wounded house. As the weak morning light filtered through the grimy windows, the fever broke. Daniel's skin, slick with sweat, began to cool. He let out a soft, sighing breath and settled into a true, deep sleep. The crisis had passed. Alara felt the tension drain from her body, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound she swayed on her feet. She sank into a chair by the hearth, her work finally done, and simply watched the boys sleep. They looked like children again, not like victims. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the peaceful silence of recovery, not the suffocating silence of death. Silas brought her a cup of coffee. He stood before her for a long moment, the steaming mug held in his hands. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions, grief, rage, and a deep, soul-shattering gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The words were rough, scraped raw from his throat. They held the weight of the entire night, of the lives she had helped him save. He stopped, unable to continue, shaking his head as if to clear it of the horrors. He finally looked over at the crate, at the white square of paper. He walked over, picked it up, and read it. His face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability extinguished, replaced by a cold, dangerous calm. He crumpled the note in his fist and threw it into the fire. He watched it burn, his expression bleak. Adeline was ash. The future was an unknown, terrifying country, but the immediate past had been cauterized. In the days that followed, a strange, fragile routine began to form within the walls of the Kane cabin. Alara found she could not bring herself to leave. To return to her own empty home felt like a betrayal, an abandonment. The boys needed her. They were physically recovering, but their spirits were bruised and wary. They moved like ghosts through their own home, speaking in whispers or not at all. They flinched at sudden movements and loud noises. The trauma had sunk deep roots. Silas threw himself into the relentless work of the ranch. His grief and rage channeled into the splitting of wood, the mending of fences, the tending of stock. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, as if he could physically exhaust the guilt that gnawed at him. He left the running of the house, and the care of his sons, entirely to Alara. She fell into the role without conscious thought. She cooked, her movements sure and steady in the unfamiliar kitchen. She cleaned away the grime of neglect, airing out the stale memories and letting the clean, cold sunlight in. She mended their torn clothes, her needle moving with a rhythmic precision that soothed her own frayed nerves. It was a life she had never imagined for herself, this sudden immersion in a family shattered by betrayal. Yet the work grounded her. The quiet purpose of it filled a void she hadn't realized was so vast. The town, of course, began to talk. The story of Adeline's flight and the boy's near-death had spread like wildfire. Now, the whispers concerned the widow who had taken up residence in Silas Kane's house. Alara felt their judgment like a physical weight when she made the necessary trip to the mercantile for supplies. Their stares were a mixture of pity, suspicion, and a prurient curiosity that made her skin crawl. She ignored them, her face a polite, neutral mask, her focus only on the list in her hand. She was no longer the town's forgotten ghost. She was now part of its newest scandal, an antagonist in a drama she had not written. But the judgment of strangers mattered little compared to the silent, wounded boys who waited for her back at the cabin. The first crack in the wall of silence came from Jacob. Alara was sitting by the fire, darning one of his socks, when he approached her. He stood for a long time, just watching her hands. "Is my pa going to die?" he asked, his voice small and hoarse from disuse. The question was so direct, so laden with fear, it startled her. She looked up from her sewing and met his gaze. "From his shoulder?" she clarified gently. He nodded, his eyes wide and serious. "No," she said, her voice full of a confidence she willed herself to feel. "He is very strong. It's a bad wound, but it's healing. He just needs time." Jacob seemed to consider this, his brow furrowed. "Adeline said he was weak," he stated, the name falling like a stone into the quiet room. She said he was a fool for going after those men. Ilara's needle stopped. Your father is not weak, she said, her voice low and fierce. He is the strongest man I have ever known. And he is no fool. He is a good father. The boy absorbed her words, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. It was a start. A few days later, one of the middle boys, Thomas, a quiet child with his father's serious eyes, shyly placed a single hardy prairie crocus on the table beside her. It was half frozen and slightly wilted, but he had picked it for her. Ilara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She put the small flower in a glass of water and set it in the center of the table, a tiny beacon of hope. Silas saw it when he came in for supper that evening. He stopped and looked at the flower, then at Ilara. He didn't say anything, but a flicker of understanding passed between them. Later that evening, as she was banking the fire for the night, he spoke, his voice quiet. Their mother, she loved those flowers. It was the first time he had mentioned his first wife. He went on, the words coming slowly, painfully. He told her about Mary, about her laughter and the warmth she had brought to the house. He spoke of his own loneliness after she died, and the terrible, foolish mistake of marrying Adeline, a woman who had seen his land and his desperation, but not his sons. He spoke not as a man seeking absolution, but simply as one who needed to give voice to his grief. Ilara listened, her heart aching for him, for the boys, for the gentle memory of the woman this house had lost. In sharing his past, he was making a space for her in his present. The fragile peace they had built was shattered by the arrival of a man named Finch. He was a gambler and a drifter, a man with cruel eyes and a reputation for trouble. He was also the man Adeline had run away with. He rode into the nearby town with a swagger that set everyone on edge, his presence a dark omen. Word reached the Kane Ranch via the mercantile owner, who delivered supplies with a warning. Finch was asking questions, telling a story about how Adeline had been cheated, how Silas Kane owed her something. He claimed she'd left behind a small fortune, a family inheritance she'd been forced to abandon. It was a lie, crafted to give his greed the thinnest veneer of justification. Ilara saw the change in Silas immediately. The weary peace in his eyes was replaced by a familiar, cold vigilance. The ranch, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. Finch did not wait long to make his move. He didn't come to the front door. He circled the property like a predator, a shadow moving along the fence line at dusk. He was testing their defenses, looking for weakness. The boys saw him. Ilara was helping them with their lessons when young Daniel, who was finally beginning to speak again, pointed a trembling finger toward the window. "Bad man," he whispered, his face pale with terror. All the progress they had made, all the fragile healing, seemed to evaporate in an instant. The boys drew together, their old, haunted expressions returning. The trauma was not a healed wound, but a sleeping beast, and Finch's presence had prodded it awake. Silas went outside, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He didn't shout or challenge. He simply stood on the porch, a silent, immovable object, and watched until Finch finally retreated into the gathering gloom. But they all knew he would be back. The threat was no longer a phantom of societal judgment or a bitter memory. It was here, real and menacing, smelling of whiskey and malice. The confrontation came 2 days later, in the harsh light of midday. Finch, emboldened by drink or desperation, rode directly into the yard. Silas met him halfway between the house and the barn. He was unarmed, having just come from shoeing a horse, his hands dirty, his posture weary but unyielding. "You're trespassing, Finch," Silas said, his voice level and dangerously quiet. Finch sneered from his horse, his gaze flicking past Silas toward the cabin. "I'm here for what's mine, what Adeline was owed. She told me all about the money her father left her. Kane, the money you hid." Silas didn't flinch. "There is no money. There never was. You were sold a lie by a liar. Now get off my land." Finch's face darkened. "I ain't leaving empty-handed," he began to dismount, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. It was the sight of the boys' faces, pressed against the cabin window like pale, terrified masks, that broke Alara's stillness. The specter of their ordeal had returned, embodied in this one greasy, cruel man. The fear she saw in their eyes ignited a fire in her own soul, burning away the last vestiges of the timid widow she had once been. Without a second thought, she pushed open the door and strode out onto the porch, placing herself directly in Finch's line of sight. "He said to leave," she called out, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. Finch's attention snapped to her. He smirked. "Well, look what we have here. Warmed his bed already. Have you? Found yourself a new meal ticket." The insult was meant to sting, to diminish her. It did not. She walked down the steps and stood beside Silas, a small, unmovable figure next to his grim strength. "There is nothing for you here," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You are a coward who consorts with a woman who would let children freeze to death. You prey on the weak. But we are not weak." As she spoke, the cabin door opened again. Jacob, the oldest, emerged, holding a heavy piece of firewood like a club. Then Thomas. Then the other two older boys. They flanked the porch steps, a silent, fierce line of defense for their home, their father, and for her. Finch looked from Alara's resolute face to Silas's cold fury, and then to the four boys standing ready. He saw not a broken man and a collection of victims, but a family, forged and hardened. His bluster evaporated. He was a bully, and his intended targets were refusing to be bullied. With a curse, he remounted his horse and galloped away, a cloud of dust his only legacy. As the dust settled, a profound quiet fell over the ranch. The air, which had been thick with menace, felt clean again. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the center of the home. The younger boys, their fear assuaged, were asleep in their beds. Alara sat in a chair by the hearth, reading a book aloud to Jacob and Thomas, her voice a calm and steady current in the quiet room. The story was simple, about a lost dog finding its way home, but tonight, the words felt resonant, filled with a deeper meaning. Silas stood by the mantel, slowly cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical task, a kind of meditation. He had not said a word about the confrontation, nor had she. There was no need. The shared danger, the unified stand, had spoken more eloquently than words ever could. When the boys finally went to bed, the silence that remained was comfortable, companionable. It was the silence of shared understanding, of a foundation that had been tested and held firm. Silas finished his work and leaned the rifle against the wall. He turned and looked at Alara, his gaze holding a depth of emotion that made her heart beat a little faster. He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. His were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Alara," he began, his voice low, "this place, these boys, they were broken. I was broken. You came into this house and you didn't just save them from the cold. You brought back the light." He looked down at their joined hands. "I am not asking you to be a housekeeper, and I would never ask you to replace what this family has lost. I am asking you to help me build something new. With me. With us." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a homecoming she had never expected. The timid ghost who had watched a wounded rider from her window was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had faced down cruelty and fear, and had discovered her own unshakable strength. She had found her purpose not in solitude, but in connection. Not in avoiding pain, but in healing it. She looked at this strong, quiet man, at the home they had salvaged from the ashes of betrayal, and she knew her answer. "Yes," she whispered. Outside, the wind still blew across the high plains, but it no longer sounded like a blade. It was just the wind, and beyond it, the stars were beginning to appear, countless and bright in the vast, promising sky.